Okay, this week I have the pleasure to introduce you to someone that I've been working with a lot lately. His name's August Black, and he is a software developer at Cycling 74. He focused on doing work with the web. But earlier this year, he kind of put out a call for some help with a project that I found really intriguing, which was a project that was a web audio-based project where people were sort of like collaborating on making a sound collage. It was really pretty interesting, and it was fun to kind of sit back and just hear people's little snippets of sound come and go. And doing that reminded me that the first time we had met, he had mentioned something about having done some other stuff with radio type things. And given how long I've been doing these podcasts now and stuff like that, I started feeling like, there is some really interesting, there's some interesting information in the whole transference and sharing on the web that we've not really talked much about in the podcast. So I reached out to August. He said he would try and grind through an interview with me. And with that, I will introduce you to August Black. Hey, August, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
All right. Thanks a lot for doing this. I know it's not probably your favorite task of the day even, but I appreciate you taking the time to kind of talk to us. So why don't we start off by having you tell us a little bit about the projects that you work on, the kind of artwork that you do.
I think primarily I'm a visual artist that works with software and radio and transmission technologies. In the past, I have worked with a bunch of, say, radio and transmission artists on various projects. I think more recently I've been developing software as conceptual art or for the use in conceptual art projects.
So in that case, then, do you consider kind of the code to be the artwork, or are you doing something that has some presentation layer to it?
In some cases, I mean, it's hard to really place where the art is nowadays.
Yeah, good point.
Oftentimes, it's not where you think it is. And in
Right,
fact, the more interesting art is like that, where you're kind of reading the plurality of meanings.
right.
And oftentimes, all that's happening outside of gallery spaces and the normal places where, you have this baggage of art history.
Yeah, well,
And
it's interesting you mentioned that because one of the things I was going to ask you about is how do you transfer this kind of work, particularly transmission type work? How does that translate into a world that really preferences work that can be shown at a gallery?
yeah, I think most cases it doesn't, unless you have, I guess, somewhat sophisticated. I don't want to say audience, but if you have someone who's willing to look at a certain activity as art that's, let's say, a little bit atypical or prototypical, then it's a little bit easier to digest and swallow. But I mean, one of the cool things about transmission and radio art is that you aren't talking to an art audience. You're talking to truck drivers and people on their way to school or running around errands or listening to the radio while they're making dinner. It has a nice horizontal, I guess, play space where you can, I guess, insert artistic activity without even people knowing it.
I think for people that aren't really keyed into what we're talking about yet, why don't you give us sort of like an example of what this kind of art would look like?
All right, why don't I just tell you about an experience I had in 1996
Perfect.
when I was kind of introduced to this idea of radio art by a group in Vienna called Kunstradio. And the Kunstradio was a weekly broadcast on the national radio of Austria. It was, I think it's already 20 or 30 years old. Um, and I went there as an intern to work with them and ended up sticking around and helping them produce, and when I say that, I mean I was on the production team making web pages and doing organizational stuff.
Okay.
Helped them produce this project called Rivers and Bridges, which was like the sequel to another project they did the year before called Horizontal Radio. And the idea was they got together a bunch of broadcasters from the European Broadcasting Association and organized satellites and organized real audio streams on the World Wide Web to interconnect artists in various places as one event.
Okay.
And the idea was to create a kind of network sculpture where you could have migratory audio patterns. Perhaps someone's looping something in Vienna that was formerly in Budapest. And of course, you're dealing with all the political issues. Back then, there wasn't even there was some Schengen territory going on, but it wasn't really European Union yet. So the whole idea of crossing borders and the political context was also another, I guess, component of this event. So that was kind of like my introduction. I was 19 years old, and I was there as an intern. I ended up sticking around and making my own radio shows. I had a weekly radio show in Linz called Fundamental Radio. I did that with my partner, Marcus Seidel. What we tried to do was go into the radio station every Thursday night and within 15 or 20 minutes try to do something on air live that was something new and something that you wouldn't typically hear on radio. And I think by that I mean not playing music and not talking about the music you're playing.
Okay. All right.
And if you think of making radio and that under those kind of constraints, it kind of opens up a world of opportunities.
Sure.
So we ended up doing a lot of things. We would record things that were an hour long, like my washing machine, and play that on air, which was actually one of our most popular shows. A lot of people called in to guess what kind of machine it was. We had another whole month we dedicated to silence, where we would just turn the mics on and not say anything, which is like the number one thing you're not supposed to do on the radio.
Right.
And people would call in like after 5 or 10 minutes. Oh man, the station's broken. I was like, no, it's not broken. We're just playing silence. And we do that all on the air. And sure enough, 2 or 3 people would call in.
Right.
Another thing we did another month of feedback. Just finding all kinds of feedback to play into the transmitter and then take out of the transmitter and feedback in.
Right.
Another like major thing you're not supposed to do in the radio studio.
Right.
And so we messed around with genre, we messed around with like the technology of radio, and then we got almost immediately interested in taking our show to other places. So we were setting up MP3 streams, which at the time in like 1998 was pretty brand new. We even wrote our own MP3 streamer to do it, and we would go set up in people's kitchens, make pasta with them, mic the pasta, mic the conversation, and that would be our show.
Right.
We were able to take this on the road a few places. Like we did a live show on the rooftop of the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland. We did a show out on the Leidsplein in Amsterdam. We did a show in Tasmania and Hobart at the museum there. So we were always game to like find context to put this show in and then make the show around the space that we were in.
Okay, sure.
Somehow. Like on the Leidsplein, we decided we would give out a beer for 30 seconds of content. So we got a bunch of people, drunk people on the street screaming into the mic, singing, telling their political views, etc., etc.
Well, this is really interesting because it seems kind of one of the big movements in art at the moment, and this kind of comes and goes, but sort of like the art of place, location-driven artwork and stuff. And it seems to me like that's exactly what this was. You would drop yourself into a place and find some way to activate the people around you.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things I like doing in the podcast is I like talking to people about their background, and the fact that you were sort of interested enough to go and intern at this Kunstradio place when you were 19 tells me that you must have had a pretty interesting background to kind of have your head. When I was 19, I was barely putting away my Kiss albums, right? So I'm kind of curious, to know where you came from. You know, what was your background that kind of had your head open to such stuff?
God, I don't even know. Oh man, I was a university student. I was studying art at Syracuse University, and my background, like in high school and stuff, I was into drawing and painting. I just drew and painted all day, every day, more or
Okay.
less.
All right.
And when I went to art school, I kind of put all that down and started making videos and performances. And I had an interesting professor. His name was Tom Sherman, who was also an artist. He had connections all over because he was head of the Canadian Council at one point. And he brought in Heidi Grundman from the Kunstradio to give a talk one year. And I just found it completely fascinating. It wasn't anything I had known about or heard about. And they had this internship at my university to do an internship abroad. It just had to be somewhat creative and something you
Okay.
couldn't do normally.
Right.
So I wrote to Heidi. I was like, "Hey, how would you like to have an artist come help you out in the show? All I need is like a sponsor there, and I'll work out the rest, and I'll get paid from this grant." And I put it together, and like only 30 people applied for this grant, and they gave out six of them. So had a good chance of winning,
Right.
and I got one, and I went over there, and of course these were like really sophisticated artists. I showed up with like paint all over my slacks and like half beat up white person dreadlocks, and and they asked me what I could do, and I said I could draw pretty pictures. They said, "All right, well, why don't you sit down in front of this computer?" They had a Macintosh 8600 and a SGI Indie. And I said, "See what you can do with graphics and maybe learn how to make websites." And so that's what I did. Ended up making I ended up making a good part of the Rivers and Bridges project's website and interacting with a bunch of artists who were involved in that project.
Interesting. So it sounds to me like prior to doing that, you didn't really have that much of a technical background at all.
Oh, zero.
Really.
Zero. I mean, yeah.
So how did you go from a guy who draws pretty pictures into a guy who develops his own MP3 streamer? What's that look like? Is
Wow,
it like
that
hanging around other people that code a lot, or
kind of, yeah. I mean, at that point, I was really into the stuff, and I don't know, I kind of come from a long line of radical do-it-yourselfers. My grandfather was a cowboy from Oklahoma. He could weld, he could do everything, fix cars. My dad's kind of like that too, and I just got in my mind that if I want something to happen, sometimes I got to do it myself. And we were really interested in building this streaming technology, which was like a radio application all in itself. You could mix channels of your files on disk and combine them and stream them out to Icecast server or whatnot. I started working on that in 1998, not really knowing how to program, but I was hanging out with another guy named Yaromil. He was a hacker from Italy. We started hacking this app together. He would do kind of the hardcore C stuff, and I was building the front end
okay?
initially in Tickle TK.
Oh wow, okay,
So I kind of migrated from websites to Tickle TK, and then we did that for 2 years. And I learned a bunch of C++, rewriting the interface in FLTK. I don't know if you ever heard of these GUI things. They're kind of
yeah,
like free
yeah, real
software,
old style
old
stuff,
school.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. And then just got more and more into it. Eventually, I was writing my own streaming applications in C and C++. I worked a lot with video and OpenGL, and I got into it and somehow left the art world and got more into like the artisanal world of digital craft and code making.
Right. Well, and it's interesting you put it that way because you are actually kind of at the root base of a number of other people, some of whom I've interviewed. So, like, I interviewed Wesley Smith, and he points to you as being one of the troublemakers that got him into coding.
Yeah, Wes and we became roommates in Santa Barbara, and I remember he was doing all kinds of crazy geometry and graphic stuff in Max, and wanted to make his own C external for it,
Right.
and I helped him on pointers, and how to get through all that. And then, man, that guy took off. Like within a week, he was like, he went well above anything I could do and see.
Well, you know, he's one of those people that math is something at the cellular level to him. You know,
Yeah,
he seems to just have an understanding of it that he can't even always articulate, but it just seems like there's a lot of clarity there for him.
totally.
So, but you know, that's him in math. It sounds to me like actually you and code kind of own the same relationship because, again, when he talked about your influence, it was sort of like you showed him how to approach coding in a way that was very comfortable to him. And I know just for myself, working with you on some web projects right now, you have a really interesting way of talking about code. It's almost as if there's like some sort of like built-in justice to the way that coding and operating systems work and stuff. And so there is kind of a right way of doing things from your perspective, which just makes it seem to me like you have some sort of internal comfort level with digital systems that an awful lot of artists don't have.
Yeah, I think if you ask, 10 different programmers what the right way of doing things, you'll get 10 different answers. But that's interesting. If you ask 10 different writers how to describe how to tie your shoelaces, you're going to get 10 different answers too.
Right.
And I think of coding that way as well. There's like the proficiency and literacy phase where you can actually write code that compiles and does something.
Hmm.
And then from there, you have all different styles and tangents.
Right.
And not all writers are the same, and not all coders are the same.
Sure.
And we often think of coding as, I don't know if it's a trade or as like in black and white. You make that work and it works. But actually, coding is more like, or writing software, I think, is it's more like a craft, or for lack of a better word, it's more like an art.
Well, it's funny because you talked about sort of like taking on the artisanal aspects of coding, and I think you're right about that because, I mean, if nothing else, you get a sense of it when you look at people's code. You can kind of get a sense of how their brain operates, how they think their way through problems. A lot of that is sort of built into the way that the code is constructed, as well as like how much do they interact with tools made by others, or are they really insular and write everything themselves? Those kind of things all kind of get embedded in the code
Oh, for sure.
in a very kind of very human way.
Oh, definitely. And like, I mean, it's immaterial software, right? You can't touch it,
Right.
but it does have form.
Yeah.
People often forget that. It's kind of like, looking at a city and just noticing, the streets, how it constructs and forms the city itself, right? And the streets, I think, is a good example because they often are so invisible to us, having grown up with automobiles and whatnot. It defines where you travel and how you navigate through space. I think code has formal aspects along those lines, and of course, the analogy isn't one to one, but
Well, no, but it has where I find that actually speaks to me. I mean, like you, I come from a lineage of do-it-yourselfers, but do-it-yourselfer, or like I tend to think of them almost as hackers, but they weren't hackers in the coding standpoint. They were hacking with an arc welder, or they were
mm,
hacking with a sawzall or something. I mean,
totally.
they had the ability. My grandfather, people would come to his barn from counties away because he could fix their graders or bulldozers or something in a way that nobody else could, right?
Right.
And my father, likewise, kind of got into it, but instead of bulldozers and stuff, he was maybe into some other stuff. But I always felt like I didn't hold up that end of the tradition because, I barely know which end of an arc welder to hold, right? And so, which is pretty dangerous actually when it comes down to arc welders.
Yeah.
But the fact is, when you put it like that about code having form and having sort of a level of construction that is similar to physical objects, that maybe makes it seem a little bit more like I'm upholding my end of my end of that lineage.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was trying to get at when I said I immediately started writing my own MP3 streamer just
Right.
because it didn't exist and I wanted to have it, you know.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So what was your education process then in terms of doing it? Was it just taking advantage of the nascent internet and digging up information that way, or did you take any formal training? How did you get the technical skills necessary to do it?
I bought a book called Sam's Teach Yourself C++ in 21 Days. And it took me probably more, 21 months. But I worked together. I just started doing it, and I was lucky. I was living with this guy, and we were just programming. We got into this project. We got a tiny, tiny bit of funding for it.
Uh-huh.
I think only like 2,000 euros and that was in 2000. We'd already been working on it for a while, and we just started doing this in our free time. And he was a somewhat decent C programmer, probably more of a system administrator and hacker. Any questions I had, I could go to him almost immediately. That was probably my training there.
I see.
And it's
Interesting.
mostly trial and error and RTFM.
Right, but still having at least someone to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah.
Once you kind of got these technical bones together, then what were some of the early projects? What did they look like? Because you talk about transmission technology and this idea of interacting with the radio, but also programming, and how does all of this stuff mesh together? What were like the early projects looking like?
Well, this one thing was the Muse multi-user streamer that we built. The other one is in 2000 I started working for the free radio stations in Austria, and I built the Cultural Broadcasting Archive, which is just a simple PHP MySQL database, but for all the free radios in Austria to archive their broadcasts. And that's still running. I worked with a bunch of artists. We were doing various projects. I worked with this guy named Rupert Huber. We built this installation called YSync, and I programmed this whole interface in JavaScript where you could move stones, like images of stones on screen, and there would be sounds hidden underneath that. And these were all kind of like, they would send network triggers to different places where the audio would be heard in the installation.
I see, sure.
But really, it's hard to like put any kind of like description on what this stuff was because it was all over the place.
Sure.
I worked with people on like commercial projects, on artistic projects, and a lot of times like the commercial projects would be creative technology projects where it was, the technology was interesting to me. We were building something new.
Right.
I worked for 2 years at the Ars Electronica Future Lab, and I did all kinds of projects there.
Yeah, so it sounds like a pretty shotgun approach to just trying a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I want to talk. I'm still trying to probe a little bit on this idea of transmission technology, and how does that differ from sort of like right now? It's kind of cool to say, "Oh, I'm working on web audio," right? How does this differ from typical web audio stuff? I mean, do you focus on always having sort of like a real world presence to this stuff, like either through a broadcast system of some sort, or is it cool to just have web audio stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the audio is somewhat secondary. I might even completely disregard it, to tell you the truth. I'm more interested in creating the space. Like with this residency I had at Wave Farm. So what the whole. Let me just explain. What I set up was a little interface that connected people online, and the audio input from your speaker at your location would be given 2 seconds on the air in sequence. So it just went round robin from one participant to the other. And you got like a little green flashing circle on your web browser when it was your turn to make noise or whatnot. At some point, some people started counting. There was tons of feedback just naturally, but also self-induced, people taking like the output of their speakers and putting it back into the microphone.
Right.
We had a bunch of like noisemakers. But there were a bunch of kids actually on there. Some parents put it on, just let their kids have fun with it. Yeah, so it changed quite a bit over time. It was pretty noisy all throughout,
Right.
but I don't know. Some part of me likes to think it was partially listenable. I was really interested in creating the space for art to happen, or creating the space for the audio to come in. I didn't create the audio. I just created a little like network interface
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
audio to travel through,
I see.
right? And I mean, I use the web audio API to get the input, maybe set the gain, make sure the gains are somewhat similar between the different participants in this, network event. But the interesting thing for me is like turning it on. And I mean, that's the interesting thing about the transmission in general. It's the space that happens when the machines are on, right?
Right.
I don't know how to describe it, but that'll impulse you get, or the electronic impulse you get from participating in this live thing where things are happening simultaneously. It's interesting. It's like watching the Super Bowl, right? You can't watch it the day after.
Right. It doesn't even make
It
sense.
doesn't make
Right.
sense, right?
Yeah.
It's that moment that counts. Everybody watching at the same time.
Okay, now I'm getting a better sense of sort of like your internal interest in doing this. And it's kind of interesting that you pointed out this way, but also because I mean the way it was set up is that it kind of round robin would drop in and then, it would like capture some noise that you made, apparently and stashing it somewhere. And it was a really interesting and sort of deep sensation to just sort of like experience what people given a 5 second platform or 10 seconds or whatever it was given this
Two
to what
2 seconds
two
per person.
seconds. Okay, well, given 2 seconds, what a 2 second platform, what is it people were incited to do? Now, I mean, on one hand, it's like, well, boy, I can't wait to get my 2 seconds. But for me, I found that it was a whole lot. I just ended up setting up a drum machine so that when it comes around to me, hopefully it would catch a drum beat or two, right? I was just fascinated, though, by just listening to people. Some people just had a desire to scream, right?
Yeah,
And other people would try and like construct. It was as if I have a whole lot to say and I only got 2 seconds to say it, right?
yeah.
It was really an amazing experience, and it was one of those things where you got this sense of that place being exciting because it was different. It put people in sort of a different environment and maybe in a not completely comfortable one.
Yeah.
And as a result, they couldn't depend on sort of like their stock reaction to carrying on a conversation or drawing attention to themselves or whatever. They had to do something else. And it
Right.
was really interesting to see how different people reacted to that. I actually think that having that really, I'm surprised it was 2 seconds because actually when it would come around, it seemed like that light was on for a long time. But
Yeah.
maybe because I was more interested in listening than performing,
Mm.
the light coming on wasn't necessarily desirable to me.
Mm.
But nevertheless, it was a really curious thing. It was interesting to see how different people reacted to that kind of stage.
Yeah, I mean, I was really unsure how people would take to it. When we first started out, we had like a backup plan of just doing like interviews and whatever. We didn't really think so many people would join in,
Right.
but we ended up doing it for 2 hours, and it changed a lot in that whole time.
Did it? As things would kind of flicker, through your speakers, you got a sense of who are the people on the other side of the line,
Totally.
which is pretty wild given if you think about the limitations of a microphone through a web browser for 2 seconds.
Yeah.
The fact that that could transmit any information at all is actually pretty surprising. So now you told me, in addition to like the coding work and stuff you did, you've actually done sort of radio programs over the years, right?
Hmm.
I mean, is this besides the stuff that you did in Europe, or was that pretty much it?
No, that was pretty much it. I left Europe in 2004 officially. I mean, I've been back a bunch and I've stayed there. I lived mostly in Vienna.
I see.
But I went and I did grad school in Santa Barbara. And at that point, I wasn't really doing radio anymore. I tried to keep it up for a while because we had this whole remote setup
Right.
where I could flip a switch and open up a live stream directly to the transmitter in Linz. But the time difference between Linz and Santa Barbara was just too big to really consider it. We did it for a couple shows, and that was it.
Yeah, would you end up with like the 4 a.m. block or something like
Oh
that?
God, yeah. What is it? It was 8 p.m. there, so it was just during the day here,
Uh-huh, I see.
which conflicted with a bunch of different
Oh yeah,
things.
absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I had enough. That was grueling too. Doing something creative once a week, every week for 5 years is it gets exhausting. You run out of ideas. You start to repeat yourself. It's not as exciting as it was when you first started. It takes a lot of dedication to keep that going.
Sure. The fact of the matter is, you've done a lot of things over a longer period of time. When you run into those kind of blocks, when you run into the kind of thing of like, man, I can't even think of something creative to do, what are the mechanisms that you do to sort of like jumpstart yourself?
Oh, I usually take a walk.
Yeah.
Unless I'm under pressure, then we just have try to have a few go-to things to do. We always had like backup, like we would go to archive.org and get a bunch of audio stuff and try to mash them together. And then my partner and I, we would just chit chat, make up all kinds of shit on the radio.
Right.
In fact, that's how we started. We went we were invited for this Kunstradio broadcast to do something. We invented this topic called "All That Space and Nowhere to Go," and just started talking and performing all around that idea. Where would you go on the internet
Right. Right.
when you can't go anywhere? So I don't. I guess to answer your question, I don't really have a go-to.
Right. Well, except it sounds like actually some of your partnerships or some of the people that you've worked with over the years have ended up being pretty influential.
Oh, totally, absolutely. In fact, doing the radio was mostly a collaborative thing anyway. I always did it with somebody else. It's hard to be in multiple places by yourself, and so it was easier to it lent itself better to having more than one person
Right.
involved.
Right. Do you ever miss it?
Uh, kind of, but I'm on to other things now.
Like what? I mean, it's you're on to other things, except you kind of came back with this wave farm project to sort of at least bring some echoes of what you were doing.
Yeah, but I think that's what I mean. I'm more into the building of the software
Building of
now
the space now,
than
yeah.
building of the space, building of the software than actually performing in it.
Interesting. Well, yeah, and to a certain extent, that is kind of a form of modern performance art. It used to be that performance art always sort of demanded the artist to be present at the performance. But there's a lot of
Yeah,
things you can do with coding that sort of set the plates without necessarily requiring your appearance.
for sure, for
And
sure.
that's kind of an interesting twist on it. What do you have planned for the future? Do you have anything in mind right now, or are you kind of in a in a midpoint?
I'm kind of in a midpoint, I guess. I mean, I would love to expand on this Wayfire residency project. I'd like to put some knobs on the time window that the users have, and maybe get hundreds of users involved and turn it into a sort of granular synthesis process where I can turn it, from a 2 second window up to 10 seconds or down to like 10 milliseconds.
Right.
I think that's the only real idea I have along those lines right now. Other than that, I'm working on my house. I'm taking care of my kids. You know, I
Yeah.
have a
Well,
garden. I
you're.
have a garden in my back that I'm growing my vegetables,
There you go.
or trying to at least. And
Well, one of the other ways that you and I are alike is having a batch of kids. How do you find? I mean, for me, my kids are getting a little older now. My youngest is 9, and so I feel like it's sort of like opening the door for more opportunity to get out and collaborate with other people and do more of my work than I had been able to for a while. How do you find the effect of kids in your life in terms of how it might affect your artwork?
it takes all the time away from being
Takes
able
all
to.
the juice, huh?
Yeah, I mean, to being an artist, to be an artist, you really, I mean, to do that full time, like make a living at it, you got to be able to, put a lot of time into it.
Right,
There's just too many artists out in the world to just do it in your spare time.
right.
Doing that takes dedication. not just to be, poor or whatnot, and to live that kind of aesthetic lifestyle until maybe you get a break or whatever. But you got to have the wherewithal to do it as a job,
Right,
doing
right,
something that you thought was fun or whatever because you were passionate about it as a job. Then, when it becomes a job, it's no longer fun anymore.
right.
No one tells you that, right? They say,
Yeah.
follow your passion or whatever. When your passion becomes your job, it kind of sucks. That, and like I got a love-hate relationship with the art world anyway. This whole relational aesthetics thing, what people actually value as art, kind of passes my ass, quite considerably. Uh, so I got all kinds of issues I got to deal with, Darwin. Not just my kids.
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting that you say that because you downplay both the amount of work that you've done and what you're doing, and because you've actually done a lot of stuff. I mean, you sent me some links, and then I did some more searching, and there's this pretty phenomenal amount of work out there that's got your name attached to it. It's pretty impressive stuff. But I think it's also interesting to talk to somebody who isn't in love with the art world. And
Yeah.
I think that especially someone willing to say when art becomes your job, it may have been a fun passion at one point, but then it's a job.
Yeah.
And a job always carries with it this like kind of emotional baggage, right? So I want to thank you for spending the time. And one last thing before we go, I think especially interesting. Your answer will be interesting on this. It's an answer a lot of interviewers kind of pull out of their hat or ass or someplace. But that is, if you were to run into a much younger version of yourself, like the 17-year-old August or whatever, what advice would you give that person, or would you wave them off of something, or would you say, "Dude, focus on this"? What would you recommend as a that might provide an appropriate course correction, or would you say
Oh
run with
man.
it? Maybe it was perfect.
I can't really imagine it being any other way, given the person that I am and like the circumstances and environments I went through. But I would probably go back just out of interest, really, and tell myself not to look at the screen. Just get away from the computer and do something else. Not because I don't, like where I'm at. I don't like programming computers. I do. I'm kind of addicted to it. But I think I have a propensity to be a different person if I had honed a different skill instead of this one.
Right,
Perhaps becoming a draftsman or artist, making, following that dream.
right,
And I would just like to see who that person was, or who that person would
right.
be.
Frankly, while I'm raising kids, I don't have a garden. I don't have this other stuff because I'm kind of addicted to looking at the screen as well. And I think it is kind of interesting to think about the paths that might have been taken if there would have been more focus on getting away from the screen, or more,
Yeah,
more focus on expanding the repertoire beyond the eighth inch jack on the back of the computer, right?
yeah. And I think at my time, I mean, that was like a really new. It was a new like territory that opened up in the art world. This whole media art thing,
Right.
and I really took to it. And I thought, God, there's just no way you can make art anymore with painting. Right? And
Right.
you can't really. I mean, the art's not the painting really. It's all like the circumstantial stuff that happens around it,
Right.
in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I still love it. I still love drawing, man. I still love looking at drawings.
Do you keep it up? Do you keep up your drawing?
Not as much. I have a sketch pad, and sometimes my wife and I will sit down and do kind of like art therapy and draw, stupid shit like cake monsters. And she likes drawing like Zizek, because she knows I like Zizek and Twin Peaks. So she does like these collages for my birthday of Zizek and inside of like Twin Peaks settings, you know. But we do stupid stuff like that. I haven't done a serious drawing in a long time. But every now and then I sit down, I paint a landscape, or I have a sketchbook and I draw something, and it's just fun.
Well, that's interesting, and that sounds like really good therapy, actually. So
Yeah, probably I should do more of it.
maybe. Well, August, I want to thank you again for the time. It was really great. We blew through that time
Yeah.
quite rapidly. It was great. Where should, for people that are interested in taking a look at your work, where's the best place to see some of it?
Yeah, I kind of hide it. My website is like my personal identity. It's og.ment.org, and there you'll be. Yeah,
og.mint.org. Okay.
yeah. I'm kind of I guess I'm still kind of internet shy. I don't
Ah,
really do much self-advertisement. But yeah, if you go to Wayfarm, you can search for me there,
okay.
find out more about my residency.
Right.
You can also go to funda.ment.org to learn more about the radio show I had with Marcus Seidel. Um, yeah,
All right. Well,
that's a
thanks.
good place to start.
Yeah, that sounds like some good net diving there. So,
Cool.
thanks for your time, and you have yourself a great day. Okay.
You too, Darwin. Take
All
it
right.
easy, man.
Bye.
Bye bye.
And there you have it. I hope that you enjoyed that chat with August Black. A couple of notes. First of all, please do me a favor and go over to our website. That's artmusictech.libsyn.com. There you're going to find the links that August talks about. He does, in fact, hide his work, so you'll need to use my links to get there. But also to check out our link for a Kickstarter that we're having in order to support the purchase of a field recorder that we'll be able to use for face-to-face interviews. So I hope that you'll take a look at that. The Kickstarter, if you want to just search for it, is called An Updated Recorder for Art Plus Music Plus Technology. I think that the project number is 8233-19547, if that helps you. But I'd appreciate if you support our purchase of a new recorder so that I can get out of the house and talk to more people. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.